everybody, welcome back to our video series where we talk to you about how you can invest in real estate. And today, Kris and I are going to talk to you a little bit about your personal financial health, which is, let's be honest, the real meat and potatoes of anything real estate, really.
Yes.
And so we're going to talk to you about this. Now, this is a shorter video. Kris actually volunteers her time to go back and help University of Maryland students in the business school learn about their personal finances. And it is a 3-hour course over 2 sessions. So obviously she knows a lot more than she's going to be able to fit in this video, but we're going to go ahead and link that so that you can take a listen to her.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, guys, for joining us. I'm really excited to be here. So obviously this is a huge topic and you need to have a strong financial plan in place prior to starting investment in real estate, right? Real estate investments are just a portion of your financial life.
All right, so I know that you feel strongly about using your personal finances to create an ideal life. What does that mean to you?
It's a great question. So everyone's personal financial strategy is very personal to their long-term goals for their life, right? So you can't just log into Google and read a couple articles and say, I'm going to just follow all of these strategies. It's very customized to what you're trying to achieve in your life. And so I think that's the important thing. You have to have an understanding of what you are trying to achieve in order to structure your financial life appropriately.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to make basic sense. So let's go through these 5 areas that you can break sort of personal financial life into. The first one being income strategy.
Yes.
What do you think is the most important for them to understand about your income strategy?
So the most important thing to understand is you need to have an understanding of how much money you make, what your budget is on a monthly basis so that you can understand how much money you can save.
That's the basics, guys. You actually have to know what your budget is.
You do.
If you don't have one, you might need to make one.
If you want, for us personally, we just do fixed expenses and then we estimate our variable based on our monthly spending.
Correct.
And that's a lot easier. I don't do the buckets for variable, but
yeah, I don't do it by a percentage. I do it based on actuals. I look at previous years, what I've spent to forecast what I'm actually going to be doing, not what I think I want to do.
Right.
All right, so let's talk about the next one, which is tax strategy. What would you say are the most important things to kind of think about in that category?
Sure. So number one, having like a good plan for your taxes, right? So do you have an accountant? Do you not have an accountant? Do you understand how to do your own tax planning? And then the next thing is, if you're self-employed, making your estimated payments and doing all of the things that are essential that you don't get pinged for not having handled your taxes appropriately. And finally, then taking a look at your portfolio, your investment strategy, and understanding your tax options there, because there's a lot of different ways that you can reduce taxes or adjust taxes through your investment strategy.
And yeah, I would argue that if you don't know what those are, you cannot track them throughout the year. And you can't try to go back and look at the year and do a good job after the fact, creating the categories.
No.
You need to know before the year starts what you're going to be looking for.
Yes. Yeah.
And just personally, because I don't love this stuff like Kris, I do have an accountant who handles this because I do not understand it.
I suggest it for most people. They are constantly aware of things that are changing, legislation that's changing, tax code that's changing, and they're going to be able to really tell you how to maximize your savings.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about insurance hedging.
Sure.
What the hell is insurance hedging? What does that mean?
Okay, so insurance strategy is actually a huge part of your financial life, right? So the reason I call it insurance hedging is because the purpose of insurance is to hedge against risk. So in the event that, for instance, life insurance, in the event someone were to pass away, you have certain obligations and they suddenly don't make money anymore. So you need to hedge against that income loss in order to ensure that you can take care of your finances after they pass. The same thing with homeowners insurance, right? You're hedging against the risk that there's a massive fire and your entire house burns down. So insurance strategy is very much a hedge. And as you become, you build a larger portfolio, you build a larger net worth, you can look at how you invest in your insurance and probably reduce that, right? So at a certain point, Danny and I will not be buying term life insurance policies anymore because we are going to have the cash available to take care of the other person should one of us pass away.
So this is something that I have heard a few times, that people think that their assets will get transferred to the people who they are, leaving in their will, presumably their family members, but could be, whomever it is, but that their expenses just magically float away. So if they rack up credit card debt, that's going to get wiped away and their assets are going to transfer.
Yeah.
I think we should dispel that because I
Yeah.
hear that one a lot.
It's unfortunately not true. Even your student loans, right? You think that you die and your student loans just sort of evaporate because you're not there to pay them. That's not true. Especially if someone was a cosigner, that cosigner is now 100% responsible for your loan. But even if someone wasn't a cosigner, what they're going to do is they're going to summarize your assets, right? Come to a total of your assets, and then they're going to summarize your debts, come to a total of your debts. You actually file a death tax return, and then they subtract, right? You have to pay those liabilities. In certain instances in which your assets do not cover your liabilities, sometimes there are ways that the people that you leave behind can negotiate that down, and there are certain debts that they don't have to pay. But if you have enough assets, you pay those debts.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's jump from that depressing topic into investing strategy. What are the
So the
highlight
only thing I
points
would
there?
say is there's one more topic, and that's estate planning.
Oh,
And that
that
ties back into the insurance planning, right? So having a will, having a power of attorney, having a living will, those are essential parts of your financial plan.
Right. I was going to jump into investing strategy as one of the 5.
I'm sorry.
You want me
I
to
jumped the
pause?
gun. No. Let's keep going.
Let's just roll through,
Let's
people.
keep going.
This is real life in COVID. So estate planning, there is a connection though between what we're talking about in this series, which is buying real estate investments, and estate planning.
Yes.
There's like an interesting point that you made before about thinking about them as a bond. Do you want to connect estate planning, the bond idea, and real estate real quick for?
Sure. Right. So a big thing about estate planning is there are 2 ways that you estate plan. One is you actually have assets that are beneficiary designated, such as your retirement accounts, and those flow independent of what your will says, right? So if your will doesn't agree with how your account was beneficiary designated, it flows the way the beneficiary designation goes. So it's really important. Like if you get divorced and your beneficiary designation was your spouse, you got to change that. Otherwise, when you die, he or she is getting that account in totality, and there's nothing that your other heirs can do about it. Mm-hmm. So then the other thing is for all assets that, such as your cash accounts, where you can't beneficiary designate, you would indicate in your will how those pass. With real estate, actually, it's how you title the real estate that handles how things pass in the event that you die. So for instance, joint tenants in common versus joint and tenancy. What's the other one? Tenants in common versus joint
tenants in entirety.
Thank you, tenants in entirety. Right? So those are 2 different ways that the assets pass. And I highly recommend before you buy any real estate, including your primary residence, you understand the options there, because it makes a big difference when you pass away.
And when you get into a real estate transaction, your title insurance company can help you with that. They can explain to you the different options. Typically, if you're buying a house while you're married, it makes the most sense just to buy them together. But if you're buying with someone, like if Kris and I bought something together, or someone where there isn't that same marriage relationship or familial relationship, it'd be more important to outline that.
Yeah. And let's say you're buying a property with a partner though, versus, your spouse, where the partner, if they were to pass away, would want it to move to their heirs, not to you. That would be a totally different titling. And so you would want to make sure you have that set up at the time that you complete your transaction. And like Hannah said, the title company is not going to prompt you for this, right? They are going to assume certain things unless you have that conversation. So just remember to do so.
And I think this is something that we'll get into a little bit later in the video series too, but it would also be important to potentially have an option to buy out the family members first, because I might want to be in a deal with Kris and rent a property with her, but her brother, I definitely couldn't work with him.
My brother's amazing.
He is. But you would want to potentially have that option to say, I'm not even going to let her brother have that chance. I'm just going to buy him out. And so there are some things there that you'll want to look into as well.
And that would be dictated in a partnership agreement. That has nothing to do with how you're going to title the property, except for the fact that it may impact it, right? So if you agree that there's going to be a buyout option, at that point, you might want to title the property differently than you were going to if there was not.
Right. And then, so back to the investing strategy that's not real estate, but just as investing as one of the 5 personal finances. Any other key points that you think we've missed that we want to add back in here?
No.
Okay.
I mean, there's tons.
There's tons, but
but no.
There's too many things. 3 hours, and that's her minimum.
Yeah,
that's her minimum,
that
of course.
My minimum.
Okay, so let's jump into savings.
Yep.
Why should people save money? How should people save money?
Sure. It's a great question. So one of the reasons that you should save money is that money actually allows you flexibility in your life, right? So if something bad were to happen and you have savings, you're in a better position. But let's say nothing bad happens. Let's say you're eternally employed, you never have any issues, but a business opportunity presents itself, or an opportunity to, you inherit property, and if you renovated it, you would double your return. Like opportunities present themselves, and if you don't have cash or investments available, you can't take advantage of those opportunities. And then the last thing is obviously retirement, right? At some point, you'd like to stop making any money or making as much money as you make now, at which point, if you don't have savings, you won't be able to do that.
So with savings, obviously we should budget for this.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Okay, so I believe in saving first, right? So again, you got to go back to your monthly budget. You look at your fixed expenses, you look at your variable expenses, but then you also take a look at your savings goals. Like, what are you trying to do? If you're trying to maximize your 401k, which is making an $18,500 contribution to your 401k, you have to sit down, break that into what your monthly cost is going to be. And then I always prioritize that first and then adjust my variable expenses appropriately. If you save first, then you most likely will save the amount that you're targeting. If you wait to the end of the month to see what's left over, not going to be much, right? That's just not the way it works.
And saving cash, what does that look like? Cash, your emergency reserve?
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? It is your emergency reserve. So beyond your emergency reserve, and let's say the rotating capital you have in your checking account, just to make sure you don't bounce any checks, everything else should be invested in one way or another. So the first bucket that you're going to save into is an emergency reserve. And the way the emergency reserve is calculated is based on how comfortable you are in and how much money you want to have available to you should something go wrong and you don't make income for a certain number of months. So you can do 3, 6, 9, 12 months.
So if you're watching the long version, you've already seen reference to this, but for those of you watching the short version, we're in the middle of this COVID-19 situation.
Yeah.
How do you think that might change how Americans see this, especially for Americans who haven't lived through tougher times before?
Yeah, it's a great question.
How do you think that impacts how people might start to view and see the emergency reserve, the amount of months that they should carry?
Yeah, so I've been reading a number of articles about millennials, younger millennials, and what's happening for them right now.
Not this kind of millennial.
Yeah, not this kind of millennial. We're the elderly.
Elder millennial. Catch it on Netflix.
It is amazing. And apparently there was, even though they saw 2008, they have entered this economic downturn with minimal, if any, savings. And it's really painting a really ugly picture for them, especially since student debt is so much higher than it is for the generation before them or even us, the elders. So
what was the number that said the average American cannot handle a $400 emergency bill?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's horrifying. Which is like your car.
And I found another interesting article that we were talking about was you were saying the student loans being the next
Right.
bubble.
So a lot of people are speculating that student loans are the next bubble. And right now we're in a situation where massive default is possible. I mean, already they're experiencing significant default. And that's one of the reasons the federal government moved to actually turn off interest over the next 6 months. And then, actually defer your payments. But I think even after 6 months, if we're still in a bad economic condition, there's going to be a serious number of defaults. And that's going to have a huge impact on that entire group of people's ability to have a healthy financial life for decades.
I just want to go off on a small tangent, but this is an interesting time, though, to just slightly discuss student loans because they do impact your real estate purchasing power and ability, especially given whether they're in deferment or whether you're making payments, the amounts.
Yeah.
But can you also touch on how you decide a little bit between making payments towards your student loans versus savings for, I know, I'm sorry.
It's a tough.
This is the toughest one.
It's a tough
I personally feel like I struggle with making this decision, paying
I struggle
myself
with this decision.
versus paying my student loans.
Yeah.
How much should I, like, for instance, I mean, so, okay, let's break it down. The first one is student loans affect your buying power.
Yes. It contributes to it's called debt to income ratio. And when we go into lending, we'll go in real depth about this, but basically they do a ratio to how much income you make versus how much debt you are committed to. And so your student loans would be in that calculation, whether you're paying them or you're in deferment. Now, if you were in deferment, I would certainly encourage you not to buy any real estate. Instead, figure out a strategy to get your loans, at least you're paying the minimums before you look at real estate investing.
And then I think just talking a little bit about how much do you pay to yourself, aka some kind of retirement savings or cash savings or whatever, versus making payments to student loans or making additional payments to student loans.
I mean, this is a huge question, right? So the question always becomes, how much do you invest versus how much do you pay down debt? And I have read countless articles about it where people have done a number of different calculations to determine. But at the end of the day, it's a personal choice, right? It has to do not only with the investment return that you have versus the cost of debt, which is your interest rate, but also has to do with your comfort level with debt, right? If you're very uncomfortable with debt, you have to take that into account, because even if you're doing the right thing on paper, but you're in a bad mental place because you don't agree with your own decisions, you need to account for that, right? If you are kept awake at night because you owe a bunch on your student loan, then you need to change your strategy and pay down your student loans faster. So, the way that I do it, and I always look at it as, I am uncomfortable, especially with student loan debt. Mortgage debt, I'm pretty much no problem with. I try to pay extra. I try to do bi-weekly or weekly payments on my mortgages so that I make an extra mortgage payment a year, but I feel like that's good enough. In terms of student loans, I go back and forth because I hate them. I hate seeing that number. And I think a lot of people feel that way, right? You just feel held back by it. Even though I think my husband's is at a 3.2% interest rate and mine's at like 3.5. That's it's basically a mortgage interest rate, and your return, if you were to put that into the market, your average return over a decade is closer to 7%, right? So there's a spread there that you're making if you invest instead. We generally, when we were younger, leaned toward investing because we knew that compounding, the power of compounding, was in our favor. And so we really focused on putting money in our retirement accounts to really get those started so that they could kind of, if we reduced it later in order to pay down our debt, the money with the initial principal was there to compound over time. Same with real estate investments. We really focused on buying those in our 20s so that we could then focus on debt in our 30s. And that's what we're doing. But I think it's a personal decision.
Yeah.
You have to, and it changes depending on your life. You have a baby, it's going to be different. So it changes.
That's why you should have a finance expert in your life that you're going to,
yes,
of some kind, who's helping you advise on this, because so far we've talked about, you have a budget, you have income, you're looking at your savings, you need a reserve account, you have retirement accounts, you have estate planning. Now we're talking about your student loans and how you're making decisions between all these. Kris and I both have MBAs. As you can see, this is obviously something she cares about. It's not something I do. Therefore, I have to hire an expert. Like Kris doesn't have to hire an expert. She does, but she doesn't have to, right? Even with an MBA, I feel like I have to. So for any average American out there, you need to have someone who can help you with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing is, like, even for me, we choose to have somebody help us because that allocates a certain amount of time in our year that we have to focus on this. Right. And we all live really busy lives, and it's easy to kind of push off your financial strategy to tomorrow when you're like, oh my gosh, I just worked a whole day. I'm tired. I don't want to deal with this. My spouse is grumpy. This is not a good time to deal with it, right? So if you have somebody in your life, I suggest a fee-based advisor, but there's a plethora of directions you can go with that. It helps you to ensure that you dedicate time to setting up your strategy and executing your strategy. You have to do this annually at the least. Mm-hmm. It's essential.
So technically, we were talking about emergency reserves. Mm-hmm. So circling back around to where we were, we want to talk about a little bit, I think, about emergency reserves, as what we're talking about here is your personal financial emergency reserve versus emergency reserves for your real estate properties.
Two totally different buckets.
Right.
So on the personal side, we talked about this, right? Your monthly expenses. Obviously, you're focusing on your essential expenses because if you were unemployed, you'd probably cancel Netflix, right? So you don't calculate Netflix, but you do include your mortgage. And that all comes to a total, and then you multiply that by the number of months you feel comfortable with. I think right now, while COVID's going on, it's a really good time to think about the number of months, because I think when everything's going well, it's easy to lean towards 3 months. But when things are not so great right now, like we're going into our third month of COVID, you're like, maybe 9. So just something to think about. In terms on the investment side, though, that's a separate bucket. Yeah.
We got to month 3 really fast, guys. So I feel like that's like, I don't know, maybe like my pause is like, you're like, yeah, but 3 months? I mean, who needs 3 months of cash? And we're going into the third month.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. And like imagine that, and then all of a sudden you have 2 vacant rental units and you can't get contractors because of COVID. And you know, I'm dealing with that right now, right? We have a vacancy right now where my contractor, I really need to do a kitchen renovation, and he is diagnosed with COVID. He's very ill, and I don't want to go with anybody else. That's my contractor, so I'm waiting, which is definitely extending my vacancy timeline. So in your separate bucket, I would suggest that you hold at least 3 months of carry, right? Because if you have a vacancy, you probably have 1 month of maintenance or improvements that you're doing to the property, and 1 month of like vacancy / advertising that's going on. And hopefully you rent within that period. But then, you know, depending on how you, your strategy, I pay a real estate agent, I pay Hannah to market my properties, and I pay her a full month when I've rented the unit, right? So even if the unit's only vacant for 2 months or a month and a half, I'm paying a whole month more than that. So I save that as essential savings in that emergency reserve. And then I also save about $5,000 per rental property, just because that's my CapEx in the event that I have a major repair.
What does CapEx mean for others?
So it's capital expenditures, which is a word tied to tax legislation and how you actually handle reporting a large repair to the IRS. So maintenance, you generally deduct dollar for dollar on that year. But when you do a larger repair, like replace a floor or put in a new HVAC unit, there's a depreciation timeline on that. And that would be categorized as a capital expenditure. And it's a larger expenditure, right? An HVAC is like $7,000 to do a whole new HVAC system. So you want to have a cushion in your emergency reserve to take care of those, because you cannot always count on, right? What if it was COVID and you were unemployed and you had vacancy in the HVAC unit now? You don't have that money. The income is not available. So.
Right. And you don't want to be taking that money from your personal money. You want to be taking that money from the property's money.
Yes, exactly. They have to sustain themselves, and that's why your calculations on how much profit you're making are so important.
All right, so let's move on to the importance of a diversified portfolio. And I was wondering if you could touch on some of the sort of misunderstandings that go into what that means and why that's important.
Sure. So a diversified portfolio, I think a lot of people think that it has something to do with the rate of return that you're earning on your money, when in fact, the purpose of diversification is actually to reduce the amount of risk and volatility in your investment portfolio. So by investing in various asset classes that move in different ways based on the economic cycle, you have the opportunity to buffer basically losses in your accounts against gains in other categories, so that you're not going to be down for your entire investment portfolio the total value of large cap equities, right? That would be painful. So you have a variety of asset classes. You would actually, I suggest you just go online, go on Google, take a quiz about your risk profile. Once you have that information, it'll tell you what categories to invest in and what percentages to do so. Every year you take a look at your entire investment portfolio and see if that's aligned. And if not, you sell in places where you have too much exposure and invest in places where you have too little. And then that way you can ensure that you are aligned in your risk profile and your investment strategy. Your
diversity you work with too.
Right.
That might make a difference in whether you go with, say, someone like Vanguard versus Fidelity.
Yeah, it might. Or like a self-directed IRA, right? You can buy alternative investments with a self-directed IRA versus like a traditional IRA at Fidelity, where you can only buy exchange traded investments.
The weeds are getting thick.
Yeah, right, exactly. So,
and then what about, do you want to touch on subclasses of equities real quick?
Yeah, like real quick. So, you've got your asset classes, which are bonds, REITs, hedge funds, equities, real estate investments, alternative investments, or those are your buckets. And then there are sub buckets to that. So for instance, with equities, you would get down into large cap stocks, small cap stock, mid cap stocks, and then you look at international investment, international stocks, and then those various same small, large, and mid. So there's multiple layers to the diversification process. And that is honestly really a place where I would also say, if you really don't know a lot about this stuff, a professional is really helpful.
So let's say we're going to skip out how complicated all of the professional retirement investing and whatnot. Just someone who's like, I do not have any clue about even the basics. What things do you think in terms of, let's say they're going to go pull all their bank statements, all their credit card statements, everything they've done, and take a look at it, like how much do I spend in gas every month? How much do I spend in healthcare a year? What is the place that someone who doesn't know anything about their finances, but just wants to start getting familiar with what money do they spend it in what buckets? What are the most important places for the basic person, not someone who's looking at even retirement investing yet? Just the basics.
So I think that if you're starting in that place, probably what you want to do is just start looking on Google Finance for some information about basic financial planning, and that'll help you develop a plan step by step of how to start the process. But I also think, again, you need to go back and have that conversation with yourself and your family about your ideal life and what you're trying to achieve. Because if you don't know that, you're not going to be able to make intelligent decisions with your financial strategy that gets you to where you want to be, right? So for me, I'm self-employed. I had always wanted to be self-employed. I knew that, and I knew I wanted to be self-employed in my 30s. So we have tailored our financial plan to ensure that that was possible. I know a lot of people who say they want to be self-employed and they have zero savings. And I'm like, well, you're not going to be able to be self-employed. Like, that's just not the way it works, right? You don't make as much money as you were making the moment you step out the door. So you have to have an understanding of that.
Okay, great. So if you don't know anything about your finances, start there. Actually look at your statements, do some math.
Yeah.
And then if you do, start doing your research and whatnot. Let's say you've done all that, then the next video we're going to talk about is how do you pay for real estate investment? So assuming that your finances are in order and you're ready to actually buy something, that's what our next video is going to be.
It's awesome. I'm excited.
Great. All right.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.